Hi everybody, TheHande here. Welcome back to the Leaders of Finland video series, and today I'll be presenting what were, in my opinion, the worst Finnish governments led by each party, except the center party, because I already covered that in a separate video. Alright, so originally I was only going to make a video covering who I thought were the worst governments led by Finland's leading right and left-leaning parties, the SDP and the NCP. If you did not watch my previous video where I talked about our shortest-lived governments and the governments which were voted out of power by a vote of no confidence, I talked about how Finland, especially during the early years and really throughout most of its history, has just had a very colorful array of governments. A single election often resulting in multiple governments forming, many of whom only lasted at most 2 years, in the worst case, less than a year. However, I felt this video was going to be a little too short if I only limited to talking about the NCP and the SDP. And of course, while the big three parties on the left, right, and center are the ones most people are familiar with, there have actually been 4 other parties that have led governments in Finland. And rather surprisingly, only one of them still exists to this day. So I will begin with what I think were the worst NCP and SDP-led governments, and then we will talk about the other parties. Now, when it came to the NCP, especially in the wake of Finnish independence, we had a lot of NCP-led governments, largely because of the way the Finnish Civil War turned out. And what's rather notable is that in recent history, NCP-led governments have become less frequent, with the NCP most frequently sharing governmental positions with the center party. And because so many NCP governments were in power during the very early years, that meant that even when they were in power for very short amounts of time, they usually passed very important legislation. So trying to find an NCP government whose societal effect would have been either negligible or just terrible was kind of difficult. There was one obvious candidate that came to mind, but looking over all the other candidates, I unfortunately just came up with the single most obvious candidate for the worst NCP government, and that was the government led by Harri Holkeri from 1987 until 1991. I've talked briefly in my previous videos how the Esko Aho government in the early 90s took a lot of the heat for Finland's terrible recession, when a lot of the blame really should have gone to the government that was in power directly before them, which was the Holkeri government. Now, the 1980s was a crazy decade, and Finland was financially in a very, very good position. Market values were going up, businesses were going up. The Holkeri government decided it was a good idea to lower taxes all across the board, because it seemed like everybody was doing so well at the time. Now, the Holkeri government probably couldn't have foreseen that the Soviet Union was going to collapse within the next 5 years, so I won't blame them for that lack of foresight. The problem was that the Soviet Union was Finland's most important export partner. And what the very loose financial policies the Holkeri government put forward meant was that at the time when interest rates were incredibly low and pretty much anybody could get a loan from any bank, is that of course a lot of people exploited the system, took out a lot of loans for businesses or something that they had absolutely no interest of actually starting, fucked up with the money, causing banks to collapse. And because taxes have been lowered, of course, the government didn't have a lot of money to patch up all those problem spots. So yeah, it might have not been their intention, but the Holkeri government's financial policies directly led to the big Finnish recession of the early 90s and directly pushed Finland into the European Union as a result of it. Now, the worst SDP government was kind of a difficult one to also nail down. The SDP has only really led a lot of governments in more recent times. There were some early examples of the government taking power in the very early days. Occasionally they also joined other parties, but almost never as the leading party. And the worst government that I eventually landed upon with the SDP was a rather unimaginative pick, I'm sorry to say, but that was definitely the third government run by Kalevi Sorsa from February 19th, 1982 till May 6th of 1983. Now, Kalevi Sorsa himself is one of Finland's most successful politicians. In fact, only one of 4 men who have become prime minister 4 times over. But also in Sorsa's case, the fact that he became prime minister 4 times over is kind of a Pyrrhic accomplishment, because the reason why his fourth government was formed directly after his third government is because of the way his third government fell into pieces. Sorsa led a largely left-leaning government in one of these defunct parties that I'm going to discuss next, which was the SKDL. And very quickly, the whole party collapsed because of ministers leaving their positions, not being happy with them, budgetary disagreements, and finally because of one of SDP's partner parties, the aforementioned SKDL, leaving the government, thus throwing the whole thing into a tailspin, leading Sorsa to tender his government's resignation. But he managed to keep his prime ministerial seat and just simply formed a new government out of the shambles of his previous one, and proving just how talented he was at this parliamentary stuff. That next government actually became the longest-lived Finnish government, a record that would be then followed by the next one, which was the Holkeri government I just mentioned. Alright, so the next two parties that also have headed Finnish governments only did it once. So the first one of these one-hit wonders was the SKDL, which is also the only other left-leaning party that has ever led a government in Finland. What the SKDL stands for was the Finnish People's Democratic League, and it was not so much a party in the traditional sense, but rather a kind of a collective of smaller left parties that then operated as a single unit in order to gain more votes. Now, as I mentioned, the SDP was a very unpopular party, especially during the first 30 or so years of Finnish independence. Even when they gained a lot of votes, most of the center and right-leaning parties didn't want to form a government with them. So the SKDL circumvented the SDP's lack of popularity very easily and managed to get into the government several times. And then for a brief period between 1946 and 1948, the Mauno-Pekkala government became the only SKDL government in history, which, by the way, also included the SDP and the Agrarian League in it. Now, if it sounds like this would have been a very powerful left-leaning government, that's exactly what a lot of people expected of them. And it also made people very nervous because there were obviously very strong communist connotations within the SKDL, and this actually did lead to the dissolvement of this particular government. However, the Mauno-Pekkala government made one very significant contribution to Finnish society, which was to write into law Finland's child benefit system, which I would guess most new parents are very happy exists. And yes, indeed, towards the very end of the government's lifespan, there started to be a lot of rumblings about the hardlining leftists or communists taking over the SKDL, and this forced the Prime Minister Pekkala into resigning the government, which was a bit controversial because nobody knows for sure if this takeover process of the SKDL was a real threat or just some more Cold War paranoia. So because they were the only SKDL-led government, Pekkala government is obviously both the best and the worst SKDL-led government. However, in the case of our only other one-hit wonder government led by a single party, that scale of being both the best and worst definitely leans in the direction of being the worst. And this is the only other government led by a party that still exists, which was the Swedish People's Party. Yes, the scruffy little Swedish People's Party did lead the government once, from May till October of 1954. And as you can probably guess, the only reason a party this small would ever become the head of the government had to do with the fact that there was considerable infighting between the Agrarian League and the SDP over who should be the prime minister. And when neither side could agree, they just came to a consensus to pick the prime minister from the Swedish People's Party, who was also in the government, and that prime minister became Ralph Törngren. However, as soon as Törngren took office, members within the SDP and the Agrarian League immediately began to scheme against him in order to grab power for themselves. So the Törngren government stayed in power for such a short amount of time and couldn't do really anything because there was a lot of scheming going on behind the scenes. Törngren himself spent the last couple of weeks on vacation, which is when most of this conspiracy managed to take place. When he came back and realized that he had lost the entire support of his own government, he tried to salvage it for a little bit, but eventually had to resign to his fate, resign the government, and the person who backstabbed him the worst was the guy who ended up becoming our only 5-time prime minister, one Urho Kekkonen. Next we have the worst government led by the Finnish Progressive Party. Now the Finnish Progressive Party is one of several weird manifestations of what was known as of Finnish liberalism. Now, like I've already mentioned, during those early years, the Finnish governments tended to be heavily right-leaning, but even within that right-leaning spectrum, there of course were differences in opinion. While the NCP these days wouldn't be considered conservative in most cases, they were very much that during the early years. And as a counterweight to them, the Finnish Progressive Party, which was a right-leaning, more liberal-thinking party, was formed, and they formed the government a good handful of times. The Mantere government, which lasted from the end of 1928 until the fall of 1929, probably suffered one of the most underwhelming ends to their reign, which is the reason I chose them as the worst government. Basically, by 1929, the wages of the members of parliament had never been raised, and this is apparently something that Mantere and his cabinet felt needed rectifying at the time. Unfortunately, their timing for this particular reform was the worst possible, because one, Finland suffered a grain shortage that year, meaning that the price of food was going to go up significantly. And there were other market pressures on Finland at the time, which raised the cost of living quite a bit, which meant that the timing for this reform came off to most people as incredibly tone-deaf and insensitive. And it's one of the few times that our second president, Lauri Relander, actually got very angry and basically forced the government to resign, which everybody might guess is a bit problematic from a democratic point of view. Some historians have even speculated that this was a very minor issue to cause the government to collapse, with many suspecting that Relander was basically just using this as an opportunity to get back at the Progressive Party, who had heckled him very openly as a weak president. And lastly, we come to the governments led by the Young Finns Party. They were called that in order to separate them from the Old Finns Party. Neither one of these parties, by the way, has any relation to the Finns Party that exists today. Both the Young Finns Party and the Old Finns Party, in fact, were parties that existed for a very short and specific period of time just before Finland became independent and a couple of years after Finland's independence. And the reason for this was because of this particular party's mission statement, which was to turn Finland, which before then was an autonomous duchy of the Russian Empire, into its own sovereign state. So, as you can guess, that after independence, both parties had basically fulfilled their purpose and essentially dissolved. They only headed two governments, and those two were actually Finland's first two governments ever. The first one led by our eventual third president, Svinhufvud, and the second one led by our eventual seventh president, Paasikivi. So you can probably guess that it was a kind of a hard pick between these two, because these two governments basically helped form the basis of our current governmental system. By the way, both of these parties were at this time still referred to as the Finnish Senate. It wasn't until the Paasikivi government that the more formal term for the Finnish government, which is Valtioneuvosto, or the Council of the State. In more casual situations, the term for the Finnish government is just Hallitus, which can also refer to the governments of other countries. It would be very difficult for me to come up with anything negative to say about Svinhufvud's government, because they were the ones who ensured Finland's pull away from the Soviet Union to become an independent country. They even stayed together through the Finnish Civil War, relocating briefly to Vaasa when the Red Guard took over the Finnish capital. So, somewhat begrudgingly, I'm going to have to say the Paasikivi government is probably the worst one, led by the Young Finns Party. And that's because this particular party, which fell due to infighting, and particularly due to an issue that really surprised me, because the pressing issue through most of the governments during the first 2 years of Finnish independence was whether Finland should have a president or a king as its head of state. And surprisingly, Paasikivi was apparently in the king camp, and this was something that some of the other parties disagreed with and ended up leaving the government, causing it to break down. A very minor reason, especially because eventually Finland's hand in this matter was forced in the direction of having a democratic republic rather than a kingdom with a parliament. Those were the worst governments led by every single party in Finland. Let me know if there was another bad government that I should have maybe talked about that I forgot to talk about. I'm Hannu the Hande Mäkinen, see you on the next one.